In the final lecture on the self under siege, we will discuss the work of Jean Baudrillard, a French social theorist. Actually, that now is a misnomer, since one of Baudrillard's theses is the disappearance of the social. Baudrillard is perhaps the most important theorist that can be characterized as postmodern. And I have spent a lot of time, in fact, in a previous lecture series discussing the postmodern. I'm going to give a very brief characterization of it and then discuss Baudrillard's relationship to it. The self under siege in modernity has always presumed that there was a self to be under siege. But in the view of Baudrillard, society has reached a point at which it has literally been overcome by its technology, and the new and important issues aren't about things like the non-believer or the non-offender, but about the non-person. In the world of Baudrillard, social relations have disappeared between humans because humans have begun to disappear. In fact, Baudrillard thinks that reality itself is in the process of disappearing, the real, what has been learned and understood under the name of the real. All these outrageous things I've just said are worked out in a brilliant series of books which draw a lot of their power from many of the phenomena we see around us. So one way to discuss Baudrillard is to run through some of these phenomena. What Baudrillard is doing is basically to trace the symptoms and tendencies of the trajectory of the postmodern. If we were really in a postmodern society, we wouldn't still be discussing things like the self under siege or the real. They would simply have disappeared. There we would be, in a way, transparently communicating one with another, as in an earlier example when I talked about the stock market crashing due to the computer rationality. Well, if we had really reached the postmodern in its fullest sense, the way Baudrillard uses it, it would be the computers unplugging us and not the reverse. The postmodern is a blurring of the lines between human beings and machines, a blurring of the line between reality and image. It is a society, or I can't even really use that word anymore. It is a world, if you will, a grouping of the world in which reality is simply that which can be simulated, Xeroxed, copied. That is one of his first theses. It's a book called Simulations. It's a very interesting thesis. Baudrillard argues that this process is that one of the central things is the way in which that's changed us fundamentally and has helped to bring our relations as humans to a close. I mean, in a way, Baudrillard sees himself as a post-apocalyptic writer. For Baudrillard, the apocalypse has already occurred. It wasn't religious or anything. It was not atomic bombs. At some point in the development of technology, human beings ceased to be the reason of things, and things took on their own reasons, technological things. Let me describe this concept of simulation just a little bit, though. Baudrillard's definition of the real itself is that which can be simulated, Xeroxed, and copied. So whether you're talking about a human body where you can make a holograph of it, or you're talking about the Bible, which you can Xerox, or whether you're talking about the sexual act, which can be simulated either through, repetitive pornographic films, or in a very near future, it will be able to be simulated with virtual reality, where you'll wear a full body suit and make love to your ego ideal, thus making it pointless to search out all the Freudian implications. You can just pick your ego ideal, punch it into the laser beam program, slip into the virtual reality suit, thus rendering that relation, even that intimate relation, sexual relation, technological, simulatable, reproducible to infinity. Now, all this sounds wild, crazy, and I don't want it to sound wild and crazy. I want it to sound the way that I think that it really should sound. And that's as though we could place ourselves, and I've used this analogy before, but I will again, as though we could place ourselves in that era right before the atomic energy and television, before we knew all the myriad changes that they would make in the way that we were and the way we interact and so on. Well, we're in a period now where I've already mentioned, and these are the phenomena that Baudrillard examines with the most care. Incredible information overloads, with information moving at incredible speed, and even to the youngest children. I talked about how children used to learn morality from their parents, and now I think that Super Mario Brothers, they spend much more time with Super Mario Brothers and are much more like emotionally involved with Nintendo than they are with their aunts, their uncles, their mothers, and their fathers. I asked one of my children, "Why are you yelling at a machine?" when he began to bang his Nintendo. And he looked at me as though I were a being from another world. And because of that, there is a postmodern trajectory. I am from another world. I'm still, as it were, caught in the modern. He's not. Why not be emotional with a machine? His peers are machine-like. We've already discussed that. I mean, in fact, what he sees on the Nintendo screen is his thrill of the day. That's the most active he's seen any simulated image that day. Now, simulation, this society didn't just come from nowhere, the society of simulations and of spectacles. Baudrillard actually builds his work on a foundation, again, that comes out of the Marxist tradition. Guy Debord wrote a book in the 60s called The Society of the Spectacle. And what it was about how when capitalism reached a certain level of accumulation, commodities began to detach themselves and become images. And citizens who formerly had played roles as political actors began to detach themselves from their own lives and become spectators. So, for example, you could say, well, instead of like going to a family reunion now, we'll just rent, you know, a Steve Martin Father of the Bride movie. It's just as good, and so on, and you meet the same kooky characters that you actually know. Their behavior is all simulatable. Another similar, and this is going to sound cynical, but I don't want it to. I mean, Baudrillard has visited our country, and when he went to Disneyland and Epcot Center and these various parks, he said, well, this is much better than Europe. The food's better than Europe. It's a short walk between France and Germany land. You know, you don't have to go through all those, deal with all those nasty waiters. Everyone's so polite. The simulation has outrun the so-called reality. That concept in Baudrillard he calls the hyper-real. Hyper-reality is more real than real. This is it actually sounds, if some of this sounds like advertising slogans, good, because in Baudrillard, the heritage of philosophy and social theory has passed over into advertising and television. So if it sounds superficial, good, because the theory, the world that he looks at has become superficial and banal. If it sounds hokey, like a salesman's pitch, good. The world he describes is the world of Jurassic Park, not of Dante. So that is all evidence on the side of Baudrillard if you follow the argument deep enough and with enough clarity. Okay, let me explain the hyperreality. This is an important concept in Baudrillard. In Baudrillard, we've already said reality is simply that which can be simulated. Can't be simulated, not real. But more real than real is a reality, and I guess I could give you, again, I hate to use these movie examples if you haven't seen the movies, but in A Clockwork Orange, there's a great line that anticipates the postmodern when the character played by Malcolm McDowell says, it's funny how blood isn't really blood until you video it on the screen, until you see it on the movie screen. In real life, it looks kind of brown and mucky. On the screen, it looks, you know, like more real than real blood. And this sense of the sort of hyper-reality we get with cinema, we get with television and so on, is another phenomenon Baudrillard wants to examine. And I think that here we get, and I mean, I guess my politics are showing again, but here we get the phenomenon of Reagan, the hyper-real president, more real than real. I mean, he's better at being Harry Truman than Harry Truman. I mean, the distinction about what he is lost in the hyper-reality of his smile, which, like the Cheshire Cat's, you know, just gleams across his face. And we get for the first time a phenomenon never known in polling, which is the phenomenon of not liking a person, but of liking a person. This is a sign you're dealing with the hyper-real. Let me go over that again. Reagan's popularity was popular. When you went through the various traits of Reagan and what Reagan stood for and his policies and so on, vast numbers of people disliked nearly all of them. What was popular was his popularity. So, and I don't think that Reagan's alone in this. Show business figures have this same thing go on for years. I can't remember the last Michael Jackson song that I even listened to. Or my kids, who also don't like Michael Jackson. But he's popular, but not in the old sense. It is a hyper-popularity, if you follow me. It is popular that he's popular. Madonna has learned to live and create herself on the curve of the postmodern by making it her goal to be more popular than popular, by having her popularity the topic of popularity. I mean, we've found out that she can't particularly act or sing. She is not built well enough to be a true cybernetic sex symbol for this period, and yet she manages, because of her understanding of this situation that Baudrillard calls the hyper-real, to stay on this curve of popularity. Hyper-reality, of course, affects us across many different spectrums, and it's built on the real. It is not as though the hyper-real could get by without injections of reality in it. It requires, and this is not a principle from Baudrillard, but one that I have realized from watching a lot of television, you have to have injections of reality in order to keep the images afloat occasionally. In fact, one of the new strategies adopted by television, and it serves two functions. One is a cost function, are these reality shows. They've realized that we've become, as it were, too intoxicated with hyper-reality, with, you know, Kojak and you know, Super Cops and so on. So now we just have shows like Cops, where you just go to Fort Worth and film a bunch of cops being cops. That serves a good, intelligent economic interest, because you don't pay cops much just for being cops. It's not that lucrative. And it injects, well, is it reality? Well, it is compared only to this scale of hyper-reality and only under the sign of being whatever can be simulated. We have just had our first simulated trial. Not our first, but the first televised one that caused a riot. Rodney King, where the events are videotaped, the trial is shown on television, the effects are all televised, and how anyone can find themselves around in these new phenomena and pretend that nothing new has happened, that frustrates both Baudrillard and myself. I mean, he's not right about everything, but clearly something's different when we're in a world like that one, like this one. Clearly something significant has changed. And it has affected the very nature of what selves are, what humans are, what subjects are. When I talked about how my students had no dreams, I mean, what is there left to dream? When I was a kid, I dreamed about dinosaurs. I had a little Walt Disney dinosaur book. Why would I need to dream about dinosaurs now? Steven Spielberg has made them. He's filmed them. They're more real than real dinosaurs. They're hyper-real. You would be disappointed if you saw a real Tyrannosaurus Rex after the movie. You would be disappointed. It wouldn't be as noisy, as scary, or as frightening. Same is true of Jaws. You know, I've actually caught some rather large sharks. I mean, I like to fish, you know, pier fish. So I've caught a few sharks, some fairly good size. But those real experiences are so boring compared to Jaws. I mean, Jaws is a hyper-real experience. Now, the only way, I mean, there's no systematic way to discuss Baudrillard because these things are not systematic. These are the shifting, contingent ways in which cultures change and the people who draw their meanings from them change as the cultures change. So all we can do here is point to certain exemplary phenomena. So let me pick out some more. We've discussed hyperreality and simulations. Let me move on. Baudrillard wrote a wonderful piece about the Gulf War. The name of the piece was "The Enemy Has Disappeared." And now, I don't want you to think that I believe what I'm about to say is my own position. I'm just giving you Baudrillard's. Because I don't think the Gulf War was planned as deeply as he does in the regards that he thought it was. Baudrillard was offered a job by a French newspaper to cover the war. So, of course, he agreed on condition he not go to the Gulf because he wanted to cover it on CNN where it would really happen. Follow me? I mean, the war would really, who won or lost would be told to us on CNN. We won't know who won or lost anywhere else, so to cover the war in the sense of hyperreality, the way to cover it is sitting in one's flat in Paris on CNN. That's how he covered the war. His thesis runs as such. He took the Gulf War very seriously. Baudrillard states that war is real if anything is. I think that's a powerful quote. If anything is real, war is, you know? I mean, if we... It sounds pessimistic, but if there's something we could still attach reality and meaning to it, if it's not war, one would wonder what it was. Because it is just an incredible human event filled with passion, pain, suffering, madness, and all that. If it's not real, what is? If anything at all would be, it would be war. According to Baudrillard's reading of the war, America, as for Baudrillard, the leading society culturally in the world, the one that leads the cultural trajectory of the world through television, movies, and so on. The war that we fought in the Gulf was not directed against the enemy. I mean, as it turned out, the enemy was left not much different than we found them. It was not directed against any enemy at all. The enemy disappeared in the show business. The war was directed against reality. The war was to show us that even war isn't real. The war was to kill the Vietnam syndrome, a war that we remember as real, as a real war. So the way to kill that memory, according to Baudrillard, is to fight a hyper-real war, complete with evening shots of shrapnel falling into Israel, which it turned out a lot of the shrapnel was from the Patriots that were fired up into the sky. I mean, the Scuds were, after all, bad Russian technology, which isn't good technology, and the technology that we had sold them wasn't our best. It's sort of, I mean, to the extent that there was some reality to the war, it was no more complex than the reason that the British won a battle in the 12th century because their bow and arrows would shoot further than the other guys so they could stand further back. Sort of the real part of the war may have been along those dimensions. But the hyper-real part was to watch the nightly Scud watch, the Scud explosions on TV. And it's hard to even evoke the feeling of togetherness the American people had in the glow of the television set, watching. And I mean, even the names are straight out of Steven Spielberg. Patriot missiles, blowing up Scuds. I mean, the poetry of the hyper-real is something, I mean, Walt Disney wouldn't do something that hokey. Patriots versus Scuds. I mean, that's worse than Darth Vader or something. I mean, so the Patriots would blow up the Scuds. Of course, later we found out, according to the Israeli military, that there were only, what, 1 or 2 confirmed hits. CNN, of course, showed those over and over and over again to us, so that as we watched the war, since those hits could be simulated, the hyper-real feeling of continuing victory and success of our technology was reinforced daily, capped off by the moral equivalent of a sportscaster's comment at the end of a game every night when the military people would get out and roll out the scorecard for the day. Very much like we do after the Bulls and Phoenix play, and we come out and sort of like the U.S. is Michael Jordan, you know, and the other side is Barkley, and Michael scored 55, Patriot missile shots, and the other side 28, and we won, you know, against the third best team in the world, the third largest army. Well, by the end of the article, I was wondering, I was going, you know, that's just way too cynical even for me. I can't buy that argument. And then I began to think about what the war looked like on TV, and a comment then I just had to start trying to find people who had been in the war. And sure enough, I found someone in Durham who had been, you know, a lot of North Carolina people go to the war. I found a young pilot, and he said, it was very exciting. And then he went on to explain to me how the sites that they used in order to, you know, fire their smart bombs were just like the games in the arcade that he grew up with. Said you know, no way in the world could he have had better practice than he got in those arcades to fire his smart bombs. I mean, it had passed him by that the real had happened, even though he was really there. I talked to a woman who had been on the ground in a Jeep for most of it. And she went, oh, the desert's so big and the sand. She said, but I really didn't get a feel for it till I got home and saw what my husband had taped. Why? Because the little individual actors sink into insignificance compared to the damn spectacle of the thing. The spectacle of it. I mean, when humans were less important than God, we could understand because he built everything. When we're less important than a Nintendo, we get confused. That's when we start thinking we're under siege. It's when Billy says, oh yes, you can kill Mom and Dad, but leave the Nintendo. Then we're rightfully upset. The postmodern trajectory leaves us in a situation where drawing the line between the real and the unreal is no longer merely philosophical, but a practical day-to-day issue. See, this is what I want to drive home. We're not off in some fairyland. This is a practical day-to-day issue of figuring out what's a simulation and what's not. Is this guy really an insurance salesman, or is he here to rob me? You know, I mean, this is no longer Cartesian doubt that one has to conjure up in a meditation. This is a wide, radical doubt about the very ground beneath our feet, it's the nature of whether it's real or not. Baudrillard says it's best at this point to simply face it that what we are witnessing is the end of the world, the end of human beings, and he thinks that there's no reason to be sad or upset or cynical about it. In fact, Baudrillard calls it the ecstasy of communication. I mean, I'm trying to do this in a kind of ironic way. I don't know how one presents this kind of material. I suggest you read books by this person. I brought one called Fatal Strategies, about things one might do under such conditions. Anyway, no, he thinks that just rather than this being occasion for some deep gloom, the ecstasy of communication means that we should go ahead and realize that America has won the Cold War. America is utopia realized. This is the country everyone dreamed of. It is, of course, with all that we know that goes along with it now, it turns out to be, like all utopias, sadly disappointing. But weren't they always? Weren't they always? Every utopia, in some sense, boring and sadly disappointing? Well, Baudrillard says no, we have to, in spite of this, we have to look upon the end of man, the world, and so on, as an opportunity. Because what were these concepts anyway? Like man and world, except concepts by which the world was regulated, policed, mapped, and controlled. All four of which are becoming more and more difficult to do under this situation of rapidly increasing complexity, which I've mentioned many times, and I mean system complexity at every level. Rapid increase in information technologies and invasions directly into the human body that interface it with machines. That goes all the way from plastic surgery to artificial hearts and implants, to virtual reality, where we'll be able to make a person who can't walk feel as though he can walk or she can walk. And I mean, this is not a technology I dreamed up. They're trying now to develop cheap, marketable versions of this, as I speak here right now. So Baudrillard doesn't want us to go, oh, it's the end of the world, it's the apocalypse. No, it's too late for that. It's already happened. If you wanted to moan, it was sort of like the moaning curve is past now, and it's time to try to sort of readjust to the flows in some way. And Baudrillard suggests a whole series of what he calls fatal strategies by which we might be able to protect what he calls our fractal selves. If you know what fractals look like in geometry, little reproduced pictures out like this is one way to think of it. Our fractal selves, split, reproducible. We have life changes now, and they've become not changes in our life. For example, to show you the distance that we've traveled, not like Augustine's conversion to Christianity, when he hears, or thinks he hears the voice of God saying, tole, lege, take, read, and he reads the scripture and becomes a Christian, and then he's a new man. He's born again. No, that's over now. Now we change, all right. We change rapidly. We change, as I said, professions 6 or 7 or 8 times, and we change who and what we are the way we used to change our clothes and our fashion. I mean, there are kids now who get through college and they're 6 different people before their junior year. 2 months as a bohemian, 2 months as a pre-med student, 2 months as a preppy, 2 months as a poet, a month and a half as a journalist, a month and a half as an ecologist, a month, and all the requisite uniforms for it. None of it felt, none of it part of affect. A fad, a personality formed as a fad, as a fashion, as an ornament. I mean, this really doesn't overstate the case for me. Well, one of the sensations this produces is not the sensations of existentialism like dread, despair, and those, but it produces new sensations. Ecstasy is one of them.